you're based. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We are seeing that there's still many people joining. We have a big group of participants today. We are very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's session on human rights due diligence, an introductory webinar offered by the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein in collaboration with Focusright, human rights consultancy based in Switzerland, Zurich. We will start right now, even though people are still joining in, but we want to make sure that we benefit of this hour that we have all together to exchange on human rights due diligence. I will now hand over to the Executive Director of the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein, Antonio Hautle, who will quickly introduce this webinar to you. Antonio, you're still muted.
Now it's better. Hello.
Perfect. Hi, Antonio.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our joint activity here. We are pleased to have you with us. I will give a very short introduction. The UN Global Compact, one of the main pillars are the human rights and the human rights due diligence. And that's why we are organizing now this series of events. Alice will give you more information right afterwards. I would like to, Sibyl, should you give this information before?
Okay, I will first give some housekeeping. I'm sorry for having jumped in directly and hand over to you. So this webinar is being recorded. This is an information we want to share with everyone. Also, it is recorded because it will be made available by the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein afterwards. So you're all muted. In case you would like to join by saying something in this group, please unmute yourself. Also activate the video so we can actually see who is talking. We have a chat function with which some people have already seen. Please feel free to use this chat function also throughout the webinar. As we are many today, maybe it's easier to use the chat function, and we will try to answer the questions that come in throughout the webinar time. I think that's the most important points for the housekeeping. I will now hand back to Antonio.
Yes, okay. And here, Antonio Hautle, for those who just joined, Executive Director of the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Why are we doing this webinar today and the series of events coming afterwards? As you know, the UN Global Compact's mission is clearly to help companies to implement the 4 pillars along the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact on human rights, ILO standards, Agenda Paris 2030, and the anti-corruption principles. So it's absolutely evident that the human rights due diligence is crucial. And in today's discussion along the COVID crisis, it is getting even more relevant and important, as we will see afterwards. What do we do in this context? What we are expecting from all our members is to be part of this global movement of sustainable companies and stakeholders to create the world we want, as we say in the slang of the UN. So the idea is really to create a world where each and everyone can live in human dignity by protecting the environment, which is the base of all our cultural and economic activities. The first thing we are asking from our members, and we are inviting all global companies to join these activities, either as member of the UN Global Compact or in their daily business practices, act responsible. Do your business decently that you can sleep well in the night and get up the next day and feel still responsible and well. So aligning the whole value chain in your organization, in your company, in your business association, in your city, etc. So that is the basic. I always say the UN Global Compact 10 principle, that is the ABC of responsible business conduct. It's basic. But as we know, especially the theme of today, this basic may become quite challenging and important as soon as we go deeper in the supply chain management and deeper in our activities. And the second one is now with the Agenda 2030, with the SDGs as objectives and the key performance indicators behind, we are inviting companies to make first a do no harm analysis on where they do have a negative impact on one of the 17 goals and 169 targets, and to reduce these negative impacts as much as possible. Step 1 and step 2, create opportunities to contribute positively to the Agenda 2030. Thus said, the context of today's webinar is exactly the human rights approach, which has a lot of impact on the 17 SDGs. And in today's context, human rights are even more important because COVID may have the tendency and bring many actors to not see anymore these relevant and important themes. With that, I hand over to Alice for the next slide for the upcoming events and activities following this webinar of today.
Hi.
I just put this here.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from my As you can see on the slide.
Alice, make sure that you're close enough to the micro. We can't hear you very well.
Now, do you hear me?
Yes, now it's fine.
Today's webinar is the first milestone of our new event series on human rights due diligence. It will be followed by an online sharing and learning on human rights impact assessment on the 11th of May and by a full day training workshop on the 23rd of June. Participants to the training workshop will also have the possibility to benefit from a company-specific coaching. Sibyl will share some more information about the events at the end of today's session, and all information are also available on our website. Good webinar, and over to Sibyl.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for this introduction, Antonia and Alice. Before we actually start directly with what is actually human rights due diligence and what's happening around the globe, let me just quickly ask some questions, which you all participants, please just use the chat function to answer some of the questions. So we just get an idea of who is here. So could you please just write in the chat function, all of you, the sector that you work in? So we see NGO, consulting, hospitality, non-profit organizations, United Nations, pharmaceutical, PO-pharma, more hospitality, energy sector, tourism sector, finance, impact investing, mining, academia, food production and distribution, compliance, ethics. So many more coming in. Please keep on writing. Anyone can see it. It's certainly interesting for people to know who is in the room. But then please also, maybe if you can add the size of your company in terms of number of employees. What is the size of your companies? 41. Anyone can have some more? 5,000 plus, 6,500 globally, 5,000, 3,800, 1,000, 45,000, 70,000. So again, we see there is a big variety of people sitting in this webinar, sharing this hour with us. Some might also want to quickly write in 1 or 2 words why you decide to join this webinar. Your motivation, why you took the time today to join us for this 1 hour. Sharpen the skills. General interest in human rights due diligence. Ensure we have the right human rights policies and approaches. Possible legislations coming up in Switzerland. Working on executive education program. Prepared to join the Global Compact as a company. have the right information, contribute to the 10 principles. So again, very interesting what's coming in there. Please keep on using the chat function if you wish to share your thoughts or your ideas throughout the webinar. I will go to the next slide where we outlined the learning objectives of today. So of course, 1 hour is not so much to learn about anything that is related to human rights due diligence. However, our goal today is to give you an overview of the international requirements in general, and also give you some important sites where you might find the relevant information that you need when you go further back to your company to implement human rights due diligence. We will use a fictive company example today to illustrate what it means to do human rights due diligence, and specifically start with you assessing your human rights risks. We start with this element because we have observed that many companies, when they start systematically approaching human rights due diligence, they start by assessing their human rights risks along the value chains. Also, today's webinar is a preparation for the workshop, which will take place on the 23rd of June, which Alice already mentioned before. So, of course, responsible business conduct has been on the agenda for quite a while, and that's what the purpose of the Global Compact in general. But as Antonio also mentioned in the introduction, COVID-19 is certainly putting us in front of many new challenges that we are facing as companies in today's world. So what we have seen is that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has already done a small analysis on what investors expect, how investors expect companies to be resilient in this time of crisis. And they see that companies who are engaging already, who have been engaging for a while on responsible business conduct, they're expected to be more resilient in the crisis that we are facing today. Of course, this is just expectations, but it's already indicating that there is a link between what is a responsible business behavior and managing a crisis responsibly. Also, we're seeing that they often have more long-term relationships and trust relationships with business partners, which can now be a benefit in reacting to this crisis when working in partnership with suppliers, for example. Also, the overview of more of the vulnerable groups, which is part of doing human rights due diligence. They are certainly also the ones which now in times of crisis are specifically at risk. So what is human rights due diligence legislations that we see coming up in Europe and around the world? But especially in Europe, we have this nice study done by the ECCY, who is actually showing which countries have started implementing human rights due diligence mandatory requirements. It's a very good overview. So you also provided by the link if you want to look into more details how these different countries are now introducing mandatory legislations. We also have a tendency of states to stick to voluntary principles when approaching human rights due diligence. We have the examples of national action plans in Germany and Switzerland. The Swiss one has been updated this January 2020. Where again, the Swiss government is emphasizing that they want businesses to do human rights due diligence voluntarily. However, they're outlining what is expected by a company, meaning to do responsible business conduct. In the case of Germany, we actually have, in the National Action Plan of Germany, the government has introduced a monitoring. So currently there is a second phase of the monitoring going on with a representative sample of German companies. And if they are not implementing human rights due diligence voluntarily, the government is actually intending to introduce mandatory legislation on human rights due diligence too. And then a website which is very useful for you if you're interested in knowing what specific countries, how specific national governments are addressing human rights due diligence, is the website provided by the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which is called, which is the globalnaps.org, where it's regularly updated, and you can actually see which states have already adopted national action plans, which ones are about or in the process of developing one, and which states are approaching this topic differently, maybe not in the form of national action plans, but they have other initiatives going on. Can I just quickly ask everyone who is not currently talking to make sure you're on mute? Just I'm hearing some noise in the background. So what is actually, when we talk about human rights due diligence, what is the international framework? So the framework we are referring to when talking about human rights due diligence, and also the framework that is being taken up by any national government who is actually introducing human rights due diligence, are the so-called United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Also, we'll often hear about the OECD responsible business conduct. So the good news is that when the guiding principles were adopted by the UN in 2011, there was a revision of the OECD guidance for multinational enterprises. And this guidance took over the concept of due diligence, which is in the guiding principles by the UN. So we can actually say that it is a harmonized approach. So if you work in line with the OECD guidance, they also have sectoral guidance for some sectors you might be aware of, you are in line with what is expected also from the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And those principles have a three-pillar approach. There's one pillar which is defining the responsibility of states to protect human rights. So what should states do in terms of legislations and other ways to actually protect human rights in their countries? And the second pillar, that's the one we are talking about now in today's webinar, is what should corporations, what should businesses do to respect human rights? And then we have a third pillar, which is the pillar access to remedy and providing people who might be affected by business operations a possibility to raise a complaint and to receive a remedy in case needed. So basically, when we talk about human rights due diligence, it's all about avoiding the negative impact that companies have through their operations directly, but also indirectly in their value chains. That's basically the whole overall goal of human rights due diligence. We might also say, yeah, human rights has been on the agenda of companies for quite some time. So talking about corporate social responsibility, there's always been this social dimension of corporate social responsibility. It's true that human rights due diligence is nothing new in this sense. However, it allows companies to approach the social dimension, the S of corporate social responsibility or of ESG more strategically. So it's all about a systematic management approach which focuses very much on processes known by companies. So it's basically a process of plan, do, check, act. Make sure you know what you're doing. And prioritize, it allows us to prioritize on the most salient issues because a company might have somehow an impact. You want to focus on as a company, and then also to have a new risk perspective. So we will talk about this later, the new risk perspective that human rights due diligence introduces in companies. Also, human rights due diligence doesn't look the same from company to company. So it is very company specific. It's all about knowing really where you as a company have potential impacts and reacting to those. And it's all about continuous improvement and not about perfection. We know that our global value chains are as such that we will always have some kind of human rights impact in our value chains. So it's all about starting strategically, knowing where to start and why, and continuously adopting an approach to human rights due diligence. Also, it's not just, it cannot be audited. It's not something which is just a certification scheme. It is really much more a management approach for companies. So now what are the key elements? We have 6 elements that are key to human rights due diligence. And again, this is something which is known to many companies, the plan, do, check, act approach. It includes a policy commitment. So as a company, you state what you mean by respecting human rights, which are the ones that you want to focus on. What are your salient issues and why? And this is a policy commitment signed by either the CEO or the board of directors. You have a proper human rights risk and management system approach, which we will talk about later. You do take measures where you have identified risks. You integrate human rights considerations in the different processes that you have as a company. This could be procurement, it could be human resources, it could be internal audits. It's really all about integrating the findings that you have, for example, that come out of a human rights risk assessment into your business operations. Then it's also about transparency, tracking the measures that you're implementing, making sure they have a positive impact on human rights and not a negative or unintended consequences that you might have because of something you do as a company. And then create transparency about it. Communicate externally what you do to implement your human rights due diligence. And then the last but not least is the question around grievance mechanism. How can you make yourself available for people who might be affected by your operations? So this might be employees at your suppliers who suffer from not being allowed to organize or to speak up, or they might have a lack of health and safety equipment, or anything that they would like to raise where they feel they cannot, they need some anonymous or some protected way to whistleblow whatever they want to say to your company. So this has been a very short overview of what the key elements are. And for the sake of today's webinar, we will focus on the risk assessment. The other elements will be covered in the workshop, which takes place on the 23rd of June. So the risk assessment is basically what is expected from companies is that they do this systematically, that they look at the whole value chain, that they conduct also impact assessments, like they go more in depth once they have identified risks, that they include external expertise when they do risk assessments, that they consult with organizations and potentially affected groups to understand what their impact is. So for today, we have invited this fictive company called Swiss Textile Limited. And I'm happy to introduce Matthias, who is actually the risk manager of this Swiss Textile Limited. And he will join us now for this section of the webinar, where he will tell us more about the approach that his company took to assess human rights risks more systematically. So welcome, Matthias. I'm glad to have you here. And could you just quickly please present yourselves and especially tell us about your company?
Okay. Good afternoon also from my side. So I'm the effective risk manager of the Swiss Textile AG based in Switzerland. It is a company having basically more than 1,200 employees in this country. And worldwide we employ more than 8,000 employees. We have outlets in major European countries, including Germany, Switzerland, also Eastern in Europe. One thing important to mention here is that we do not have our own production plant. So we basically buy our products in countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, and China, so classical textile producing countries. And we have not our own production plants. We're basically a retailer of textiles.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. I heard, or I think many of us heard, that your company has had a serious incident at one of your suppliers back in 2018. I think it happened in Bangladesh, if I'm not mistaken. Could you just give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. We had actually an incident in 2018, which was also in the media. 150 textile workers, mainly female workers, as mainly female workers are working in those production plants, have been killed, and 50 have been partly seriously injured. This happened even though an external audit, so we or usually or used to work with external audit companies to confirm compliance with national and international regulations concerning security standards in those plants, concerning occupational health and safety. So despite having this audits and external verification, during actually the incident factory windows and emergency exits were locked, and leading to the casualties of 150 textile workers. The company actually that was affected was one of our long-term key suppliers. It was a very important partner, and as a consequence, actually our company was then sued in 2018. So this was somehow was a turning point for our company, I would say. At this time, then we took the decision to introduce a more systematic approach towards human rights due diligence, as you have presented it, and go beyond the classical auditing. So we realized that there needs to be done more. Auditing is a part of the whole process, but it's not enough. So what we did in the first step basically is starting at our value chain and not only looking into our supply chain.
Okay, so but what do you mean by looking at the value chain? So how did you do that concretely?
So we started looking into the different elements of our value chain. As you said, also we looked into the upstream and downstream value chain. What was quite new to us, because again here we can see that the scope that the company has to consider when assessing human rights risks is along the entire value chain. So we looked into the value chain and started mapping it out. So we started with the agricultural production, including the cotton production in the various countries. We then looked into the whole processing, the fiber production part, the wet processing, the textile finishing, transportation one from the countries we produce the textiles, such as Bangladesh and Pakistan, to our logistical center, distribution center in Germany, but also from the center then to our retail stores in Germany and into other countries. So there was a next element we looked into, then the whole own retail stores. So as said, we have a huge network of own retail stores in different countries. The consumption in terms of textile is mainly through washing and how the textiles and the t-shirts, for example, are being used by our consumers. And last but not least, we also considered the whole end-of-life part in terms of reuse, recycling, and also the combustion of the t-shirts or textiles that have not been used. So that was basically the starting point. In reality, obviously, you might know that textile value chain might look much more complex, but as a starting point, this kind of simplification of a value chain can help you then identify risks along the value chain.
So what did you do with this? So you had this mapping and better understanding of your, I guess, supply chain and in general value chain partners. But what was the next step?
I think it helped us really to look in more details into the value chain and starting identifying potential risks in each of the value chain element with a focus on the potentially affected groups. So we not only looked into the company risks, so the human rights lens basically asks us to look into how actually we are having potential impacts on the rights holders along the different value chain elements. So for example, in the agricultural production, you can see different potential impacts and risks we analyzed. We used along the whole value chain, we used internal and external sources to assess human rights risks and impacts. So it was mainly a desktop research. We talked to a lot of internal people, people from the production, people from sales. So we basically had a huge consultation process already in mapping out the risks along the value chain. As a starting point, we considered all human rights in our risk assessment. Traditionally, I would say the focus was mainly on reputational, financial, and operational risks. So that was my perspective as a risk manager. So we obviously knew that there is child labor happening, working hours, occupational health and safety might be an issue, but we did not really consider community impacts, for example, or forced labor as examples in our supply chain. So when you look, for example, into the agricultural production, we can see above, I mean, the child labor issues we knew already before. There are issues related and risks and impacts related to forced labor, occupational health and safety, but also, for example, environmental impact. So you might know that the cotton production uses a vast amount of water, which can lead to conflicts with the local communities, competition over fresh water, access to fresh water. So that was how we started assessing the risk, for example, in the agricultural production. In the processing part, but actually the incident happened, you can see again that child labor might be a risk, the question of discrimination of certain workers. So especially in countries such as India and Pakistan, we have the caste system, so there might be a lot of discrimination. Freedom of association is quite often a topic in this area. So that might have occur to risks and impact in the supply chain in the processing part. Transportation, the issue of long driving hours in the countries, overtime not being paid, again, a question of fair wages. Those were the issues we have identified there. Going on into the retail part, we know that people working in the retail part in European countries, they do get a decent salary, but still the question of fair wages, working hours, overtimes not being paid, were potential risks we have identified in retail. Consumption, mainly environmental impacts through the use and washing of our T-shirt. And as I mentioned before, the end of life element when, for example, again, the question of the reuse, the recycling, the combustion, which might lead to environmental impacts. So you can see that we started out basically mapping the risks along our value chain in a very detailed analysis, which helped us then making the next step.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting, Matthias. I'm seeing one question coming in from Hiva, who is asking who were the team members or functions that you involved in this mapping process?
Just jumping back one slide, I mean, when you talk about the agricultural production, obviously we talked to our suppliers, we talked to persons who have experience in the textile sector working on agricultural production. We are also members of different networks. There is the Textile Bündnis in Germany. We work with certain label organizations. So there is actually a lot of information available on the different websites of those networks and partners we work with. Processing, we looked, obviously, we regularly check our main partners, our main factories. So here we are working mainly with our buyers, with the purchasing department. Transportation was mainly the colleagues from logistics who make sure that the textiles are getting to the country on time. Retail, we talked a lot with people from retail as well, but also human resources gave us quite interesting information there. And then the consumption end of life again was working with external partners, with experts to get some idea on potential risks. So I would say it was a mix of experts we consulted, internal stakeholders, networks we tapped into, but also working with our direct partners in the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. I think that answers the question very well. For me, I mean, it sounds very interesting, but it sounds also like quite a big exercise. And I'm seeing also a lot of risks now you have on the list, or you had on the list. So how did you now prioritize? How did you go about, like, from this long list of risks to make it more clear on what you want to focus on as a company?
Yes, as risk managers, we we love those kind of matrices you can see here. So we started identifying high, medium, and low risks along the supply chain. So this helped us then again starting the prioritization process. So what has been new for me was basically the way into how you look at risk. So traditionally, a risk manager would think in terms of impact. What is the potential impact, mainly on financial impacts on EBIT or whatever. So the thinking of impact and then the potential of likelihood. So that is basically how we would traditionally think as risk managers in terms of risk. Now what we did, we looking into the international guidelines in terms of human rights diligence, you have to look it into with the perspective of severity, which means that you look into the scale, scope, and remediability. So what does it mean? So one is when you talk about scale, you ask the question, how important is the negative impact on the human rights? So it's about the impact on a potential human right, such as access to water. Then scope, you look into the number of affected people. So how many rights holders are affected? Is it a small group of people? Is it a large group of people? And last but not least, the remediability, you can really ask the question, can these impacts be remediated, and in how much time? So is there possibility to pay a compensation or another way for remediability?
Okay, thank you. I'm seeing also a question coming in from Megan, who is exactly asking about this remediability. Maybe, do you have an example of what does it mean to assess remediability?
Yeah, I think when coming back a little bit to the concrete case, obviously we had obviously quite a vast negative impact by having this 150 casualties. So the question is then, how can you potentially compensate it, or how can you compensate if a company is producing cotton in the supply chain and taking the water from the local community? So how can you basically find a balance to manage this kind of impacts? Whether you buy a new water source, whether you compensate the community, whether you pay some money to communities, to members that have been affected in the factory. So there are different ways in terms of remediability you can look into. It's also a question of time. Can you do this quite quickly? Is it something you can fix quite quickly, or does it take a longer time because there are also some political systems or whatever in place that are often hindering a quick response?
Okay, and in this chart now, do you have an example of like how you assessed, like how did you come about these red marks, for example, in this chart?
Yeah, give you one example in terms of child labor, for example. If you look into child labor in the processing in the factories, often children there are exposed to chemicals. They have incurable health issues and long-term development deficits because they cannot go to school, for example. So scale and remediability might make the issue quite severe. So if a child is working in a factory, is getting really sick, and cannot attend school, for example, makes it quite severe. So that's why we put it in red, even though probably the scope might be limited, but if only 10 children might be affected in the factories we work with, in the processing part, still we would give it a red flag. Okay,
thank you. That's interesting. Before we go to assessing how you decided what to do, or how you assessed your leverage, I see one question still came in on how you gathered all this information. So the question is, first, how did you get this information? Was it through workshops or consultations? And questionnaires, and which method is working well, you think?
Again, I would say similar to what I said before. Certainly, when you talk about human and workers' rights along the value chain, it makes a lot of sense to talk to experts, and experts can be manifold, can be international organizations. So, for example, we worked with UNICEF in India and in Bangladesh. When it came to occupational health and safety, obviously there are many other organizations in the country, and that was one thing. Environmental impacts. You also have a lot of environmental organizations that are used to work with the private sector and have a lot of information available. They are also willing to share, such as WWF. So there are many sources and experts you can tap in, and then obviously. It was, again, a lot of internal work, partly interviewing people in the factories, gathering information along the value chain from different sources, internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, including experts, and obviously also, again, working with organizations such as the Textile Bündnis, Fairwear Foundation, looking into what NGOs have been publishing on certain issues. So again, it's a huge mix of different information you can pull into to analyze the risks here.
So it's actually, if I understand correctly, like based on a desk research, you already had a list of specific issues, and then you had qualitative interviews discussing also the severity with different stakeholders.
Exactly. I think you have some sort of already a feeling in the company you work with, what are the risks, also based on the work we did before. So it's not kind of completely new what we started here. So we knew that there are issues on forced labor and child labor in certainly the supply chain. We knew that there were issues in terms of wages and working hours along the value chain. So it's not completely new. So the mapping exercise, I think that went quite well in terms of sources and information we have. The definition in terms of severity, we pulled in experts who could help us in doing so.
Yeah, I guess it's something it's not something you can just put in a questionnaire. I guess this concept of scale scope remediability is something to really qualitatively discuss with people. Exactly. I guess it's too complex and difficult, and it's company specific. Yeah. Okay, so let's just move on to how you decided or defined. So what is your leverage? I see you have a nice matrix there that you want to share with us. Can you also explain to us how you went about defining the leverage? Mm-hmm. And what is the leverage?
So what we did here, I mean, what we did before the traffic lights, the matrix I showed you before, helped us to define the severity of each issue, which is on one axis. The second axis you would look into to start prioritizing risks and identify the salient issues for your company is also looking into leverage. So how do you identify the leverage? You would look into, again, three terms that you might know. It's the cost, contribute, and linked to. So if a company directly, or if an impact is directly caused by its own operation, you would say this is caused by the company. So for example, if in our retail stores, we would not pay the minimum salaries, or we would have issues there, obviously we as a company would cause this issue because we own the retail stores. These are our own employees, so this is cost. Contributing to an impact means that we contributed together with other actors, such as our factories we are working with in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, or through our logistical and transportation partners. So when you are working together with other actors, then you might contribute to a certain impact. And then last, the linked to means that you might be linked to an impact through business relationships which go further down the value chain upstream and or downstream, not necessarily with a direct partner and supplier, but if, for example, then our facility production plant in Bangladesh would again work with other business partners in terms of cotton production, and then there might be an impact in terms of environmental issues or child labor in this part of the value chain we as a company are linked to. So that's basically how you can analyze, again, what you can do as a company, obviously, where you have a high impact, which you directly cause. The leverage and the way to act is obviously much more easier than to certain impacts where you're only linked to.
Okay, so maybe, I mean, I think I understand the concept, but maybe it's easier if you can give us an example of a specific topic that you placed on this chart.
Mm-hmm. I can give you start with 3 concrete examples. First, again, starting with child labor. So we have an impact through our business relationships in supply chain and child labor, which is mainly an issue, as we've seen in the agriculture and processing part, as we've seen in the matrix. So, but child labor does not seem to be an issue in our own operations, in retail, in transportation, that we directly control. So that's we're saying the severity in terms of child labor, as we've seen before in the matrix, is quite high, but obviously the leverage as it goes really further down the supply chain into agriculture, partly into the processing part, is low to medium, I would say. Another example, working hours. Working hours can be influenced in factories by our own purchasing practices, how we deal with our suppliers in terms of lead times, delivery times. So we can have quite an impact on working hours in factories. So if the delivery time and the lead time is quite short, obviously the workers they have to work much harder, much longer in order to make sure that they deliver on time. So we have a higher leverage here in terms of working hour. So that's why it's medium as we contribute to these risks through our own operations. Then the working hours, we have seen that working hours are an issue in our retail stores, but certainly also in the supply chain. But in the retail stores, as I mentioned before, the employees are our own employees. So they have a contract from our company. But we still would place it as medium because there are certain issues in the supply chain. So taking this example, I would say in our retail stores, this is caused by our own operations, but in the supply chain, we are contributing to it when we talk about probably wages and working hours. So you can see that many topics are here on the left side of the axis, as our leverage on those risks are mainly in the supply chain is medium to low. And I would say this is mainly due to our business model. If we would have our own production plants in Bangladesh and Pakistan, for example, obviously the leverage would be much higher on many risks we have identified.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess you then also took all the other topics and tried to place them on the matrix. Eric is asking the question, which is of course very, very relevant. I mean, you have this value chain analysis where you actually have the topics for each value chain element, and then you have the challenge that in this matrix, from a company perspective, headquarter perspective, you have to put it into one matrix, even though you have like the same topic maybe happening on the agricultural and also in the processing phase or in your own operations. So I'm assuming that this is a challenge, but you're doing it consciously, that you're summarizing it in one chart, because in the end you have to have your senior commitment and you have to simplify somehow. I mean, technically you would maybe ideally do it for each value chain element.
Exactly.
Correct?
Exactly. At the same time, you also have to be clear that this matrix is kind of it's work in progress. You know, the business model changed, the suppliers changed. So this is not a one-off exercise you would do. Topics might become more severe, might become less severe. Leverage might change because of new acquisitions or sales of certain business units. So this is an ongoing process, as risk management is anyway. So it's not a one-off exercise. And then obviously whether you would put a certain element at a certain point in the two axes can lead to quite lengthy discussions within the companies, obviously with also external stakeholders, as there are many interests, obviously, and many people think, for example, this might be much more important, and others say this is less relevant. So it's a constant negotiation, I would say, but still you have to place it somewhere. And I think the graph here gives a very good overview on what are really the severe impacts and what we can do. And the next question would then also be, what can you do now?
Yeah, I think one point we still need to mention is that there is consciously, the matrix isn't divided into 4 quarters, but there is actually a rainbow or whatever, a bow that you introduced. And I think that leads to the question that Megan was asking also, that she's asking if you have limited leverage, if you can then also as a company argue that you don't have a necessity to act. And I think the concept of saliency here, maybe you want to say a word about this outer bow, which, if I understand correctly, your company decided to identify forced labor, child labor, occupational health and safety, environmental impacts, and working conditions as salient issues.
Exactly. So
even though you have limited leverage on forced labor.
Exactly. I think the outer bow says, okay, based on the concept of human rights due diligence, that's where you should do something, because they are salient, they are highly severe, and there is a certain leverage. So we cannot only look into from the perspective of the company and saying, okay, now our leverage is basically low to medium, and we cannot do anything. So based on the outer bow, actually, we are somehow, we have to act and we have to implement certain measures. And we have identified those 5 topics that are in the outer bow as the salient issues that we want to take further. Not saying that discrimination, freedom of association are not relevant, but I think it's also fair to say from a company perspective, and which helps you as well, is to say, okay, this exercise gives you some sort of a chance to prioritize certain issues, and you have to start somewhere, and you cannot do everything from one day to another. So this matrix gives you the opportunity to prioritize issues and to start working on them, not saying that the other topics are not relevant. Okay, thank you very much. I mean, we would love to hear now more about what you did with these salient issues and how you defined measures. But I know this is a topic for the workshop, so you will be there as well and help us, give us some inputs on how you actually went from this risk assessment to taking measures. I think before we end this webinar, could you just, in terms of this current COVID situation, just quickly, before we close, say, how does it affect your work now, the COVID situation? And how do you feel, is it maybe also helping that you already have the system in place in this time of crisis? Yeah, I think obviously, as for all of us, COVID has disrupted the current way of doing business. And for a risk manager, actually, it's also interesting time. We have to ensure ongoing operations, financial liquidity, but we also want to make sure that we act responsibly and take care of the most vulnerable people in the supply chain, because the majority, as we have seen, of the garment workers are women, often concentrated in low pay, low power position, with, for example, additional unpaid childcare duty. So COVID-19 has put them now in particular risk. So what we try to do as a company is that we want to make sure that that, for example, orders that have already been completed are not cancelled and agreed payment terms are met. Late deliveries that result from the impact will not be sanctioned. And I think the whole approach of human rights due diligence helped us to understand in much more details who are already the vulnerable groups in our value chain, especially in this context in the supply chain. So we know that we have to look into women's rights and child rights, for example. I think what we also realized that those long-term partnerships with our suppliers that we wanted to build or still want to build based on trust helps now to make sure that we have a guaranteed supply and that in a more collaborative approach we try to find common solutions. So it's not that we are just contracting certain factories, so it's much more a collaboration where we want to find common solution. And last but not least, I think what we realize in the companies that there is a general awareness on human rights topics, because we have been doing quite a lot in terms of training and workshops for the employees, for the management. So the whole embedding and integrating respect for human rights, the work we have done over the last 2 or 3 years, we see now that there's much more awareness on human rights related topics in our company.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthias. I think this was a very good example for us to better understand how responsible business conduct and what it means also in times of crisis. We have been able to actually respond, I think, to all the questions that came in throughout this webinar. So if people still have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And in the meanwhile, we will ask you in the name of the Global Compact Network Switzerland to quickly respond to the survey and say which elements of human rights due diligence you would actually like to learn more about. And this can then potentially be considered also by the Global Compact Network Switzerland to better understand what kind of interests you have. So just click in the chat function. You can see there is a questionnaire with these questions, and just click. You can click on more than one if you want to indicate which element you would like to learn more about. I'm keeping this open while I'm just finishing up with announcing the 2 next events. The next one, which will take place on May 11th, is an online session called Sharing and Learning, where we have 2 Swiss companies, Their Touristic Switzerland and Dormakaba Group, who are going to present, and these are now not fictive examples, these are now real companies. They will tell us about their approach to assessing human rights impacts. And we will have the workshop we have mentioned before, which will take place on 23rd of June, where we will work with you on your value chain mapping, which we heard today, risk prioritization, and then actually go into developing individual roadmaps for your company. So it's a 1-day workshop where active participation is required, and also this webinar is a precondition, so you actually know how we are aiming to work with you in this workshop, and you'll have some preparatory work to do. You can still register online, the links are provided, and you will receive the slides also. So maybe we can close the survey now and see your interests. Okay, I'll let this happen in the background while I'll hand over to Antonio to close this session and say a few words still on the UN action against COVID and the responsible business conduct.
Thank you, Sibyl. Thank you, Matthias, very much for this introduction into human rights due diligence and the overview. Just a question others may have asked too. This 1-day meeting will be probably, if we can make it, physical, but it depends a little bit on the situation, and we will have to decide how we exactly can do it, just for those who are interested, but we plan really to do it. So that's the one, and then I go to the last one. As if you are a UN Global Compact member, you may have already got a lot of information what the UN Global Compact at the global and local level is doing. So I just invite you for our Global Compact Academy. It's an academy series going on in the next weeks. It's already the fourth one tomorrow. This academy is free for each and everyone, taking up high-level speakers around the globe. And now on how do we respond as business sector to the COVID crisis. So you're welcome to register on our unglobalcompact.org website whenever you want and are interested. And the UN has edited a UN business guide on COVID-19. It will be updated on a regular basis. So it's more how especially larger companies, but also smaller companies can tackle the COVID crisis for their suppliers, for their employees, for their own operations. And we have the UN Development Program rapid self-assessment for businesses. So just use the link, human rights due diligence and COVID-19. Many of the themes were being touched in the presentation just right now. And human rights in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, it just came out last week, a very interesting guide from the Institute of Human Rights and Business, with whom we are collaborating on a regular basis too. You have an OECD Responsible Business Conduct publication, and the same from ELO. And ELO has much more information on these issues. So if you go to the ELO website, you will find a lot of helpful material for smaller and for larger companies. If you need assistance or help, don't hesitate to contact me, Alice, or our secretariat. We are happy to help you. And last but not least, we want to publish selected examples of our participants' commitment against COVID-19, and we would be happy to have contributions from your side, short videos, written statements, small examples, maybe with a link. What are you doing? How do you respond in a positive sense, either locally here or in your supply chain or distribution chain, or if you're a big transnational, as some of you are, what are you doing abroad in your subsidiaries and other countries? With that, I would really like to thank you all. Is there a last comment from Sibyl and Matthias' side?
No, we would just also like to thank everyone for the active participation, also for sharing questions in the chat. I think this was very interesting for us also to see what kind of questions come up, and we are looking forward to any further events and participations.
Okay, then with this, thank you very much, all of us. We hope that you could take some helpful information out of this, and we are looking forward to see you online, or hopefully quite soon also in person again in one of these connected events, activities, or in other events we will having in the next couple of months. So good afternoon and see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Sibyl, should we take, or do we do that